Welcome, chosen X. You awaken to a hush that feels like both verdict and invitation, a hush shaped by a history that refused to stay small. For seasons you move through rooms as if wearing a coat sewn from other people's claims, pockets full of borrowed accusations and threadbare proofs that never fit. That weight taught you how silence could become survival, how withdrawal could be mistaken for submission, how stepping back might read as surrender in the imagining of others. Yet inside that retreat something rearranged in ways you could not name at first. You learned to listen differently. First you notice rhythm instead of rumor, the small pattern behind a smile, the cadence in a story retold that always favors one narrator. You notice how statements bend around the teller like light warping through glass. In time you witness the pattern repeat, not as isolated cruelty but as a habit with fingerprints. That discovery is terrible and freeing at once because it tells you were not alone in feeling off. It tells you the discrepancy was never only in you. Now the world feels less like a battlefield and more like a theater where scripts are swapped beneath the stage. Actors exit with applause while props are left to absorb blame. Someone else perfected playing hurt until spectators mistook performance for pain. The strange mercy in the center of this is that performances eventually tire. Masks, even well-tailored ones, begin to loosen where fabric meets breath. You keep records of gestures rather than gossip. A glance, a late message, the way laughter lands when someone should be reflective. Over months these details compile into a landscape you can walk across and read. You are careful not because you want vindication but because you owe yourself clarity. And clarity has a shape. It is not loud. It is not vengeful. It is precise. People who once trusted a polished tale begin to encounter a dissonance that does not resolve. A cousin remembers two versions of a trip. A colleague recollects facts that were absent from the dominant story. Conversations start to converge like tributaries meeting a river. When these small currents join, they generate emotion that is impossible to stop with a single accusation. The collective intake of breath begins. As these currents move, the architecture of falsehood shows its seams. It is humbling to realize that many were complicit without malice, convinced by repetition and by a charismatic person who taught others how to doubt you more convincingly than you ever doubted yourself. This is a subtler cruelty because it wraps itself in concern and good advice. That is why your own restraint and commitment to truth are acts of courage, because calm testimony in a loud room sometimes reads as weakness. You have also cultivated tenderness. Despite harm, you find moments where compassion lands like an anchor. These moments are not contradictions. They are calibrations that prove your capacity to hold complexity. You can both name harm and still refuse hatred. This capacity unsettles those who need a single, consumable story. You are not a trophy of their narrative. You are a person whose boundaries clarify the landscape for everyone around you. There is a turning where curiosity becomes bravery. Someone new looks closer than the crowd ever cared to look. They notice mismatches. They read messages with a patience that mirrors yours. They ask quiet, pointed questions, and where others deflect they persist. This person is not your savior and you do not need rescue. They are witness, and witness has power because it moves the story out of private rooms into shared memory. When the first crack appears in a carefully constructed account, it feels anticlimactic and enormous at once. The reveal is rarely cinematic. It is a sequence of small recognitions, a rehearsed phrase used where it could not possibly fit, an alibi that forgets an earlier detail, a defensive posture that repeats like a recorded loop. For those paying attention, patterns are proof. For you, the pattern lifts a weight you had learned to carry so well you have forgotten its mass. You do not celebrate ruin. You practice discretion. You do not call people to account to watch them fall. Instead, you allow space for truth to live where it wants. That is when restoration begins to show itself in slow, consistent gestures, a previously closed door open to a conversation, a nod from someone who once recoiled, a revisit of a memory that now includes what was omitted. Those small acts are not theatrical. They are the quiet currency of repair. Through this process you recompose yourself. Loss is acknowledged as legitimate while new alignments are welcomed without desperation. You keep your own counsel, but you also accept that being seen by others can be a bomb. Emerging does not mean returning to who you were before. It means arriving at a version of yourself sharpened by you become someone who moves forward with a steady heart. You begin to hear the tremor beneath polite conversation, a nervous undercurrent that betrays rehearsed lines. In rooms filled with smiling faces, you trace the pattern of omission, the way facts are trimmed to suit a tidy narrative. You do this quietly. You do this without announcing an inquiry. A soft attention becomes your instrument. Small details that once felt insignificant gather meaning. A misplaced date, a laugh that lands too quickly, a story that shifts when retold. Those fragments accumulate like weathered stones along a shoreline. Alone they would pass for coincidence. Together they outline a coastline you can navigate with surprising clarity. Others start to notice irregularities as well. A neighbor mentions a memory that refuses to match the prevailing tale. A colleague recalls a timeline that contradicts the dominant version. These private acknowledgments travel in whispers, then in longer messages, then in conversations that reweave what people thought they knew. What was once a single voice begins to sound thin when contrasted with many testimonies. The person at the center of the original story has trained a language of deflection, or rhetoric so practiced it appears sincere. They have learned to lean into sympathy and to present their version as a refuge. You learn that charisma and repetition can persuade without being truthful. You learn that projection is an economy of defense, the faults they name in you are illusions drawn from their own interior. You do not respond with spectacle. You refuse to build drama. Instead, you hold precise records of what you observe and allow those records to be shared in time. Witnessing becomes a communal act rather than a solitary crusade. People compare notes and find resonance. Those resonances weaken the authority of the constructed narrative because lived memory resists being rewritten without resistance. When a single discrepancy is tested, it ripples outward. A message surfaced, a meeting recalled, a timestamp that will not bend. Each confirmation is another small light in a dim room. The accumulation has a centrifugal effect on mendacity. Lies that relied upon isolation find themselves exposed to daylight. You practice a measured generosity that recalibrates relationships rather than destroys them. You set limits that define instead of punish. You allow others the dignity of realizing mistakes privately. This approach draws people who are capable of listening and repels those who are allergic to accountability. It is not a strategy of power but of integrity. As patterns align, the person who relied on misdirection begins to tighten. Defensive maneuvers that once worked falter. Old scripts sound mechanical when the audience remembers the original moments and refuses the replay. Some defenders double down out of fear. Others quietly withdraw. Accountability does not always arrive as confrontation, it often appears as a series of private reckonings and altered behaviors. Truth propagates in fragments rather than proclamations. A forwarded message here, a candid remark there, a reunion of timelines across separate conversations. Those fragments bond into a larger clarity. Restoration appears as revisions made gently and honestly, not as theatrical reversal. Through all of this you remain an axis of calm. Your lack of fury does not equal passivity. It communicates a steadiness that invites others to verify rather than to vilify. Those who seek truth find refuge in your example. They share what they saw, and in doing so they reconstruct a social memory more faithful to events than to rumor. The process is neither linear nor guaranteed. There are setbacks. There are moments when misinformation resurges. Yet the accumulation of first-hand accounts grows like a slow tide. It alters the landscape by changing what people accept as credible. In that shifting field, your reputation is not reclaimed by force. It is restored by the patient, precise joining of details that always favored what really happened over what someone insisted must be true. Over time, the architect feels a subtle shrinkage in influence as allies recalibrate their memories and priorities. Invitations that once arrived without question slow to a trickle. Stories meant to bind begin to fray. You avoid seizing those moments because your aim is coherence, not retribution. New collaborations appear around people who choose accountability over convenience. Those collaborations are not instant salvation but reliable terrain where reputation is rebuilt through repeated acts rather than slogans. You become a reference not by insisting on the truth but by living it. Credibility brings careful company and opens doors that had been quietly barred. The social landscape reconfigures around facts rather than fiction, and in that reconfiguration you feel relief and responsibility. Your next steps are not a return to naive trust but a progressive embrace of discernment. You hold that balance with quiet courage. You feel the surface give under a careful pressure, not with violence but with the honest wear of time and attention. Cracks spider outward like the slow mapping of frost on glass, and where the fissures travel they let in a light that carries more than illumination. That light holds context. It returns missing chapters and rearranges the order of meaning. Memory no longer functions as a liable witness to a single version of events. It begins to speak in chorus. At first the shifts are almost microscopically quiet. You notice corners of conversations that now look like evidence. A laughter that lands before a truth can be finished. A face that tightens when asked a simple question. A borrowed anecdote repeated with new detail each retelling. These are not accusations so much as invitations to connect dots. Your job is not to prosecute. Your task is to listen closely enough for the pattern to name itself. When the veil loosens, reality does not implode into clarity all at once. Revelation moves like weather. There are moments of sudden brightness and long stretches of gray. You find yourself returning again and again to the same small places where truth has nested. You study messages you once dismissed. You revisit a day you thought you understood. Each pass brings another filament of insight into view. The architecture of deception is revealed not by demolition but by patient inspection. People whom you thought irretrievably distant begin, in private, to admit inconsistencies. Those private confessions do not explode into drama. They form a slow, steady tide of recognition. As these acknowledgments accumulate, the social field changes. What had felt like an unquestioned reality starts to wobble under the weight of remembered detail. You learn that public belief holds until it is offered an alternative made from actual recollection rather than rumor. The person who curated falsehoods senses the movement and tightens. Their gestures become more mechanical. The stories they tell begin to carry echoes of rehearsal. Where spontaneity used to be convincing, now it reads as performance. That is not your triumph. It is simply a disclosure of character made by an unwilling self. The effect for you is not gloating. It is an expulsion of heavy uncertainty from your system. There is an odd grief that accompanies this shedding. You mourn the time that the lie stole from you, the relationships that frayed because others believed a narrative more convenient than the facts. Mourning is not performed as weakness. It is honored as a form of truthfulness. You name the losses, and by naming them you make space for different kinds of return. Restoration is not automatic, but it becomes possible where before it was unimaginable. In the midst of the unraveling you encounter a curious phenomenon. Those very attributes once maligned as faults begin to reveal themselves as forms of integrity. The boundaries that were called harsh are seen as careful limits. The candor that was described as cruelty becomes recognizable as clarity. Observers begin to recalibrate their language. They trade caricature for nuance. In offering this recalibration they give you back pieces of yourself that had been misframed. At some point you reach toward forgiveness without romanticizing what happened. You understand that forgiving does not mean condoning. It means refusing to carry the grievance as your permanent identity. This is how you reclaim your narrative. Forgiveness is the tool with which you dismantle vengeance as a future plan. It is a way of honoring your own forward motion without being consumed by the past. As the mist clears more clearly, the social topology rewrites itself. People who once deflected now listen. Connections that had been paused begin to resume on new terms. Opportunities that were shadowed by rumor emerge as actual openings. This is not magical replenishment. It is the practical consequence of reality aligning with attentive testimony. When many witnesses offer concordant recollection, Circumstances adapt accordingly. You notice a change in your body as well. There is a steadier rhythm to your breath. You rest with less fear. Your presence becomes less defensive and more available for genuine exchange. This is not a sign of arrogance. It is the sign of a nervous system learning that it can trust the world incrementally again. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop explaining the contours of your interior life to those unwilling to accept evidence. There is also an ethical demand that grows with the clearing. You must decide how to move among those who harmed you. Total withdrawal is one option. Repair after careful accountability is another. You choose boundaries that hold both compassion and firmness. Your aim is not to punish. Your intent is to preserve space for flourishing. That requires discernment and courage in equal measure. By the end of this phase, you are not merely surviving exposure. You are being remade by it. Secrets that once anchored other people to power lose their efficacy. The light that came in through the cracks is not only proof. It is instruction. It teaches you what to refuse, whom to trust, and how to orient toward a life that values truth above performative loyalty. The veil is not completely gone, and more learning lies ahead. Still, you stand with clearer edges and a quieter authority. You have become someone who can walk through rooms without carrying the weight of someone else's narrative. You have become someone who knows how to let what is false fall away and how to hold what is real. You step forward into a clearing where the air itself feels calibrated to notice you. The space holds no accusation. It holds the attentive hush of a place that has been waiting for an arrival of this clarity. You are not entering triumphantly. You are arriving with a patient steadiness that carries both grief and resolution. The gravity of the moment is not spectacle but consequence. You have practiced restraint until it shaped your posture and tightened your focus. Every choice from here on is a decision made in the open. You determine where to invest effort and where to conserve strength. Authority arrives not from a loud claim but from an unassailable coherence between word and action. People sense that coherence because it is rare. It has an audible quality like a bell struck once in a quiet hall. When the note rings, it invites reorientation. Those who cultivated stories around your quiet occasions feel the shift as pressure on their practices. Their influence recedes because truth has a peculiar economy. It pays those who move in integrity and bankrupts manipulations that depended on obscurity. You watch as formerly comfortable alliances thin like fog warmed by sunlight. This thinning feels like accountability in motion even though you do not orchestrate it. You take measures that are practical and humane. You restore conversations that deserve restoration and refuse exchanges that only perpetuate old harms. You offer explanations not to persuade but to illuminate, and you withdraw from debates that exist to distract. Those who are willing to reckon do so. They approach with humility and with a clear willingness to repair harm. You do not rush reconciliation. You permit time to test sincerity because trust is built by consistent patterns, not words alone. There is power in refusing to perform outrage. Your calm becomes a scaffold that supports people moving from denial to acknowledgement. You model repair in ways that are visible and steady. When wrongdoing is acknowledged, you ask for tangible steps rather than rhetorical remorse. You have learned that accountability requires change, not just confession. As influence wanes for those who profited from distortion, new leaders emerge who operate with care. They will not be flashy or loud. They appear as people who show up reliably and who center service over spectacle. Your role is not to anoint them. It is to be vigilant and supportive when integrity surfaces. You promote environments where observation is valued and where memory is treated with respect. Structural shifts follow relational ones. Invitations that once felt hollow become genuine opportunities because they are extended by people whose intentions align with their words. The opportunities are not miraculous. They are the result of repeated choices to act in good faith. You accept assignments that match your renewed criteria and decline those that reopen old wounds. Choosing this way creates momentum that is sustainable because it conforms with your boundaries. There are moments of disorientation as the shape of your days adjusts. Old rhythms dissolve and new routines emerge. You find pleasure in small rituals that center you. You sleep in a steadier pattern. You keep company with people whose presence feels restorative. The texture of daily life shifts from survival to cultivation. When you walk into rooms, people observe a distinct poise. It is not a posture meant to intimidate. It communicates that you require honesty and that you will not tolerate manipulation. This presence modulates interactions. Conversations become more direct and less performative. People respond by showing up with clearer intentions. The public contours of your life begin to reflect the private integrity you have nurtured. Where gossip once occupied space, now clearer accounts and measured appreciations occupy that same place. Recognition follows careful action. Doors that were previously obstructed open because reputation and consistency have created that corridor. It is not instantaneous. It is the slow aligning of consequence with character. You do not treat those changes as confirmation of worth. You acknowledge the work that brought you here and you remain committed to continued growth. Pride is tempered by the knowledge that vulnerability is essential and that humility sustains connection. You allow appreciation to arrive without clinging to it because attachment distorts clarity. There are still tests in which your resolve is measured. Old triggers surface and require you to act from learned steadiness instead of reflex. Each test becomes an opportunity to demonstrate the habits you have formed. When you respond from presence rather than reactivity, you secure the trust that will carry future collaboration. By choosing steadiness and clarity, you transform the conditions that once enabled distortion. The social fabric rewires around trust and predictability. You become a source of measured leadership because you embody the principle that integrity produces reliable outcomes. In this season, you are recognized not as a spectacle but as a quiet center that steadies others through example. You remain steady and your example guides all. Now you stand in a season where the small alignments you tend to become deliberate pathways rather than chance, and the world begins to reshape around the steadiness you practiced. Time no longer feels like an injury to hide, it becomes a horizon to cross with measured breath. Repair arrives through continuity and quiet acts instead of spectacle, and you are remade by the steady accumulation of faithful practices. Each morning you greet your attention and answer it with a simple ritual that honors presence and restraint. Around you the maps of association redraw themselves. People who once confused rumor for reality begin to privilege direct encounter and first-hand recollection. Those who trafficked in tidy tales discover their accounts thin when memory is placed beside narrative. New alliances sprout from the soil you tended, composed of reciprocity, mutual clarity, and steady care rather than grand declarations or illusion. Language becomes refined in your hands. Words lose their capacity to wound because you choose sentences that build rather than dismantle. When you explain, you link threads instead of litigating chapters, and when you refuse, you do so with a tone that closes doors without collapsing them into traps. People notice this modulation and expectations shift because your speech aligns with habit, creating corridors where trust can be rebuilt through repeated right choices. You become a careful steward of testimony and memory. Instead of collecting credit, you gather recollection and preserve it against distortion. When others recover what was omitted, you help place those details into a shared record that honors fact without weaponizing it. This modest, precise labor creates an archive available to anyone who later needs confirmation and invites a culture of responsible accountability. Old actors may return with polished lines and familiar theatrics to test whether your restraint was merely a tactic. You welcome accountability and measure sincerity against sustained behavior and witness. You do not rush to repair every rupture, but you will not tolerate cycles that replicate harm. Where genuine openness appears, you engage. Where manipulation repeats, you withdraw in order to protect presence rather than to prove a point. As private life and public consequence come into alignment, you notice doors opening along corridors that were once sealed. Opportunities arise not as miracles but as consequences of integrity and steady labor. Invitations arrive from people seeking partnership rather than performance, and resources follow as tools to build projects that sustain life and meaning. You accept with humility because you remember scarcity, and you decline what would compromise the ground you tend. Your interior life settles into a creative field. You cultivate rituals that center curiosity, rest, and consistent attention. Friendships become reciprocal and nourishing, and you allow pleasure without guilt because survival was never intended to stand as the summit of your story. Quiet joys reshape your weeks, and generosity grows as a natural expression rather than as posture meant to earn approval. There comes a moment when those who once hurt you carry consequence, and you feel no appetite for triumph. You treat their unraveling as evidence that choices return to origin rather than as fuel for revenge. Compassion moves beside the boundary because empathy does not require reopening wounds, and this posture preserves your heart while keeping the future safe for meaningful generosity. Now, as this chapter closes, a new invitation arrives in a different register. In the middle of your screen, a short film will appear that continues this transmission in image and voice. That piece is not a substitute for lived practice but a companion to it. If you are drawn to watch, allow the visuals and sound to meet the work you do in private and let the film act as both mirror and companion. If the material resonates, consider subscribing so future episodes arrive in alignment with your rhythm, and enable notifications so that calls to return reach you at moments that support your next right movement. This is not vanity or hollow triumph. It is stewardship of inner resources that gives the world steadiness. Your days feel quieter and wider, filled with practice that yields clarity instead of noise. At times you will be tempted to revert to old patterns, yet the habits you formed now provide a discipline you can return to, and returning sustains the work rather than undermines it. Accept this season as both reward and responsibility, and carry the care you learned into every room you enter. You leave this passage knowing restoration is not a single event but an ongoing discipline. You move forward with a quiet authority that refuses to collapse into old narratives, and wherever you travel next you carry the practice of simple truthfulness that alters landscapes by fidelity rather than force.